I've been using the bus for 2 years now to go to college. It's not the longest ride, but it's not the shortest either. It's about 40 minutes from my house, which leaves me time to review notes or just put on my headphones and let the music fill the silence. Most days, the passengers were the same. Students like me, office workers, some older people who were probably heading to the market. Nothing out of the ordinary. But a few weeks ago, I started to notice something. A man, maybe in his 50s, always got on at the same stop as me, on the corner of my street. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He sat a few rows ahead, almost always near the window, with a plastic bag in his hands. He seemed to carry it tight against his chest, as if it were something very important to him. I didn't care. We all have our oddities, I thought. But then, I started to notice something else. The man was murmuring. Not always, but on some rides I could hear him. Even though he was several rows back, it was a whisper, as if he were talking to someone. I didn't know he was there sometimes. He would stare at other passengers, but not all of them, just a few in particular. I convinced myself that he was just a weird guy and that I was overreacting. But there was something about the way his eyes would stay fixed on a person that made me uncomfortable. It was like he saw something that the others couldn't. I tried to ignore it like most awkward things on public transport. But deep down, something in me had already started to change. One day, while I was listening to music and trying to concentrate on my phone, I felt like someone was watching me. When I looked up, there he was, his eyes fixed on me. I froze, not because of the fact that he was looking at me, but because of the intensity. He didn't look away. He didn't even blink. It was like he was waiting for something. I looked down quickly, pretending like I didn't care, but I felt a discomfort that wouldn't go away. That night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't get it out of my head. The way he looked at me, there was something deeply disturbing in that look. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had been just an idea. We all have bad days, and maybe he was just lost in his thoughts. That's why he had looked at me like that. I repeated that to myself over and over again as I got on the morning bus. As always, he was already sitting in his usual spot near the window, with his plastic bag pressed against his chest. I avoided looking at him. I put my headphones on and concentrated on the music. But as the bus moved forward, something forced me to take a quick look in his direction. I saw him staring straight ahead, with his lips barely moving. He was mumbling again. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but the cadence of his lips made my hair stand on end. It was a constant murmur, almost rhythmic, but he didn't seem to be talking to himself. His gaze was fixed on an older woman who was 2 seats in front of him. The funny thing was that the woman didn't notice. She didn't seem to notice that the man was looking at her without blinking. She was clutching her purse in her lap, staring straight ahead with a lost look. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. Maybe the guy had some kind of problem, a mental illness, something that had nothing to do with me nor with the others. But that discomfort in my stomach did not disappear. It seemed to have settled there, like a weight that I could not shake. When I got to the university, I tried to concentrate in class. It was difficult. The teachers were talking, the classmates were taking notes, but my mind went back again and again to the bus, to that man, to his murmurs, to the way he had looked at the woman. Something inside me screamed that it was not just eccentric behavior, that there was something more at stake. That afternoon, I decided to take the bus back home a little later than usual. I waited an hour, thinking that maybe if I avoided the regular schedule, I could avoid that man too. But when I got on the bus, I saw him again, sitting in the same place, with the plastic bag on his lap. My heart skipped a beat, but I decided not to sit so close to him. I went to the back of the bus as far as possible. While the bus moved through the streets, I realized that I was not the only one who noticed something strange. Some passengers looked at the man furtively, as if they also felt that something was not right. However, no one said anything. No one complained or made a gesture. I realized it wasn't just me, but for some reason, we all seemed to agree that it was best not to intervene. It was then that something happened that left me completely uneasy. At one of the stops, the older woman who had been sitting near him that morning got back on the bus. She seemed different. There was something in her posture, the way she looked around, as if she was completely disoriented. She sat in front but kept staring into space. And the most disturbing thing of all is that the man didn't look at her this time. He didn't even murmur. He simply lowered his head to his bag, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it must be a coincidence. Couldn't be related. Or could it? That night, as I lay in my bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Her appearance had changed, as if something in her had broken. I remembered how that morning she had been just another passenger, looking out the window, and then in the afternoon, she seemed lost, disconnected. It was as if something had happened in that period of time, something I didn't understand. The man, on the other hand, continued being an enigma to me. What was he doing with that bag? What was he mumbling? And most importantly, why was he only looking at certain people? I couldn't help but wonder if the woman had been one of those people, if she had been under his gaze before changing that way. The next day, I decided to take the bus again at my usual time, but this time with more attention. I was determined to observe him, to see if there was a pattern, something that would allow me to understand what was happening. I got on the bus, and as always, he was already there in his place with the bag in his hands. The same barely perceptible whisper, the same furtive glances. He wasn't mumbling all the time, but when he did, he seemed to be completely absorbed in his words, as if it were the only thing that mattered at that moment. During the trip, I realized that another person had caught his attention. A middle-aged man dressed in a dark suit and with a briefcase, who seemed to be one of those typical office workers that are always seen on the route. The man on the bus stared at him, muttering. But this time, something different happened. The office worker, upon noticing that they were looking at him, turned around and looked back at him. What happened at that moment was disturbing. The man with the bag didn't look away. The two of them stared at each other as if they were in a silent duel. The office worker frowned uncomfortably and then abruptly stood up, looking towards the back of the bus, as if he couldn't stand to be any closer to him. I could see the fear in his eyes, but the man with the bag didn't stop looking at him for a second, not even after the office worker had moved. To my surprise, the office worker didn't get off at his usual stop. In fact, at the next stop, he hurriedly got up and ran off the bus, as if he couldn't be there any longer. His exit was so sudden that even the driver looked at him strangely. I stood frozen in my seat, watching the scene, wondering if what I had just witnessed made any sense, or if it was just another coincidence. But deep down, something told me it wasn't. The man with the bag looked down again, this time without murmuring. He seemed satisfied. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something in that look, in the way he behaved, that made me feel like I wasn't dealing with a simple stranger. There was something else. The days went by, and I kept taking the same bus, always hoping that he wouldn't be there. But every morning, I would find him in his place. His presence had become unbearable for me. I could no longer ignore him. I had become obsessed with him, with his murmurs, with the way he looked at others. Every time I got on, I would sit as far away as possible, but still, I felt his presence like a shadow I couldn't shake. And then one day something changed. It was a Friday. I got on the bus as usual, but the man was not in his seat. The first feeling was one of relief. I thought it was finally over. Maybe he had changed his routine, or with some luck, he had decided never to come back. I sat in my usual spot, put on my headphones, and tried to concentrate on my notes, enjoying the tranquility that I hadn't felt for weeks. The bus moved along its route without incident. But when we got to the stop where he usually got off, the relief vanished. He was there, waiting on the sidewalk with his bag in his hands. He didn't get on the bus. He just looked at us, or rather, he looked at me. He looked at me with his intense and penetrating gaze. He didn't deviate for a second. It was as if he was waiting for me, as if he knew something that I didn't. The bus started, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something was wrong, very wrong. As we walked away, the journey of that day felt endless, as if every second was on the edge of an abyss. The other passengers continued their routine as if nothing, but for me, the world had changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of his eyes fixed on mine continued to haunt me, like a shadow that didn't dissolve in the darkness. When I finally managed to close my eyes, I dreamed of him. In my dream, I was alone on the bus. He was there, with the bag on his lap, whispering my name over and over again. The next day, I decided to walk to the university. I avoided the bus at all costs, but the weight of his gaze would not leave me, and deep down, I knew that no matter how much I tried to run away, he had left something in me. Something that I couldn't see but that I felt getting closer and closer. And for some reason, I was convinced that one day I would see him again. And that time, he wouldn't let me go. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I don't usually travel by bus. The time, the discomfort of the seats, and the noise of the engines began to bother me. But this time I had no choice. It was a long trip, more than 10 hours, and the only available seat was at the back, next to the window. I settled in with a sigh, leaving my bag on my lap next to me. A man of about 30 years old was already sitting there, looking out the window thoughtfully. I didn't want to bother him, so I settled in silently, trying to find a position where I could relax. While the bus moved slowly along the road, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to dissolve. I like to think that long trips give time to think, to reflect on what we have done and what we have left behind. However, that day, a strange feeling took over me, as if something was not quite right. The minutes passed, and the landscape went from being an endless parade of city lights to the tranquility of the open road. Eventually, the man next to me looked away from the window and, in a gesture that surprised me, began to talk. "Long day, no?" he said with a deep but kind voice. I looked at him out of the corner of my eye, trying to gauge his intention before answering. His face, although young, had a tired expression, as if he had seen too much for his age. "Yes, quite a lot. These types of trips tend to be endless," I replied with a polite smile. I'm not one to talk much with strangers, but sometimes it's better to let the conversation flow instead of maintaining an awkward silence. "Do you travel alone?" he asked. "I always do," I answered without thinking much about it. "My life has been like this for years. Lonely trips, time for myself and my thoughts." He nodded as if he understood perfectly, but after a few seconds, he looked at me again, as if he was looking for something more. I didn't know if it was curiosity or simple courtesy, but I decided to tell him more. "There was a time when I didn't always travel alone," I said, surprised to be confessing this to a stranger. "Years ago, I took a trip like this, but it ended very badly." His expression changed slightly, as if he had just heard something he didn't expect. "Bad? How is that?" he asked, showing genuine interest. I sighed, looking towards the front of the bus, remembering that day, that memory I always tried to bury deep in my mind. The bus moved forward in silence, except for the purr of its engine and the occasional murmur of other passengers, which allowed me to evoke the memories I had been avoiding for years. "I was much younger then," I began. "I was traveling with a friend. A trip to disconnect from everything, to forget about work and the stress of life itself. It was a trip without a fixed course, which makes what happened next even more terrifying." I noticed how the man next to me tensed a little. Maybe he didn't expect the conversation to turn somber so soon, but his silence encouraged me to continue talking about it. After so many years, it was, in a way, liberating. We took a bus like this, but the road we traveled that time was much more remote. The landscape became increasingly strange, more desolate. There were no houses, no stops or anything. Just a long, empty road. The bus we were on now seemed to resonate with my words. The atmosphere around us felt heavier, as if my memories had begun to permeate the air. Outside, the landscape was no longer visible. The night had taken over the road, and only the weak lights of the streetlights occasionally illuminated the edges of the road. The man did not take his eyes off me expectantly. I felt a slight shiver as I remembered the details. I don't know when it hit me, but the bus wouldn't stop. The feeling that something was wrong began to grow within us. We asked the driver, but he didn't answer. We couldn't understand why he didn't stop at the stations. I looked at the man out of the corner of my eye and saw how he leaned slightly towards me, as if he expected me to reveal a hidden secret. My friend, Sarah, tried to calm me down. She said that maybe we had taken a wrong route, but I knew it wasn't. It wasn't the route, it was the bus. Or maybe something else. The bus we were now riding on shuddered slightly, as if the road had a pothole. The man frowned, also noticing the strange coincidence, but he didn't say anything. I felt the air around us become denser, more charged, and I surprised myself wondering if what I was telling him wasn't just a bad memory but something else. What happened next? His voice sounded barely a whisper, but it was clear that he didn't want to interrupt me. I nodded slowly, knowing that I had not yet reached the most important part of the story. My heart was beating faster, and although I knew that this was just a memory, the fear I felt back then was beginning to surface again. After a while, the lights on the bus began to fail. First, a flicker, then total darkness for a few seconds. And in that darkness, I heard something. It wasn't the engine or the passengers. It was like a whisper, but it didn't come from anyone inside the bus. It was something from outside, or maybe from inside, but I couldn't see it. I paused and noticed how the atmosphere in the bus we were traveling on now seemed to be changing in a similar way. The light in the hallways flickered once, and a chill ran down my spine. However, I wasn't sure if it was because of my memories or because of what was happening around us. The man next to me remained silent, but I felt that he was also affected by what I was telling him. I decided to continue, despite the knot that was beginning to form in my stomach. Sarah didn't hear it, or at least that's what she said. But I knew something was there, something I couldn't see. I insisted that we had to get off at the next stop, although the bus had not stopped for hours. And when it finally did, I paused and noticed how my breathing got heavier. It wasn't a regular stop. It was something else, a place I didn't recognize. The bus stopped in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs of a station or city lights, not even a nearby road that could tell us where we were. Just a stretch of old asphalt and the darkness surrounding us. The man next to me remained silent, but his gaze kept watching me with an intensity that made me nervous. I didn't know if it was because of the story or something else, but I felt that every word that came out of my mouth affected him in some way. I asked Sarah not to get off the bus. Something didn't feel right, but she stopped for a second, remembering the desperation on her face. She was determined, she wanted answers, and I just wanted the damn trip to end. However, something about that stop, in that place, made me feel that if we got off, we wouldn't come back. It was a horrible feeling, as if everything that kept me connected to reality was fading away in that moment. The bus we were on now, the present, moved with a creak, and for a moment it seemed like the temperature had dropped. The murmur of the passengers had diminished, and the lights on the ceiling seemed dimmer. Despite being seated comfortably, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. "And they got off?" he asked, leaning a little towards me, as if he feared the answer. "Not exactly," I answered, looking at him intently for the first time since the story had begun. Sarah wanted to get off, but as soon as she got up and walked towards the door, the driver slammed it shut. It was so sudden that she jumped back. He didn't say anything. He just looked at us through the rearview mirror with that empty look he had had throughout the trip. I noticed how the man next to me began to frown. It was as if the story was enveloping him, trapping him in the same feeling of unease that I had felt so many years ago. The bus began to move again, I said, remembering that moment clearly. Sarah returned to her seat, but at that point, the atmosphere was already unbearable. There was something in the air, like a presence, something we couldn't see but was definitely there. I had never felt such an irrational fear. The worst thing was that although the bus was moving forward, it didn't seem to be going anywhere. The landscape didn't change, and the lights on the road were increasingly distant, weaker, until they disappeared completely. Beside me, the man shifted in his seat, as if the discomfort I was describing now also affected him. The feeling on the bus we were on had also become strange. The gentle rocking of the vehicle and the constant sound of the engine seemed more muffled, as if we were traveling through a space that wasn't entirely real. "What did they do?" he asked in a voice that had lost its confident tone from before. "There wasn't much we could do," I answered, knowing I was getting to the hardest part to tell. After a while, Sarah began to whisper to me that there was something on the bus. I didn't understand what she meant. I looked around, but I didn't see anything at first. But then I felt it. The air around us grew colder, and I heard footsteps. I don't know where they came from because the hallway was empty, but they were clear, as if someone was walking towards us from the front of the bus. I paused, trying not to let the panic of that moment take over me again. The man was looking at me expectantly, but it wasn't the only look I felt. I glanced sideways at the other passengers on our current bus and noticed that several seemed restless. Maybe it was the discomfort of the long trip, or maybe the atmosphere had changed for everyone. The steps stopped right next to us, I said, lowering my voice until it became a whisper. There was no one there, but we knew something was with us. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. We were trapped. We couldn't get off and the bus wouldn't stop. We stayed in our seats, trembling, waiting for something. The man let out a shaky sigh, and I realized he was as immersed in the story as I was at that moment. But the worst had yet to come. Suddenly, Sarah began to murmur strange things she hadn't said before. She was talking about someone who was following us, someone who knew our name. I didn't know what she was talking about. I tried to calm her down, but she was completely terrified. I had never seen her like this before. Then, in a moment of pure desperation, she tried to open the window to jump off the moving bus. I grabbed her, and we screamed for help, but no one was listening to us. The other passengers seemed absent. The current bus gave a stronger jolt, and I noticed how some passengers looked nervously around them, as if something in the environment was affecting everyone in a similar way. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the bus stopped. But this time, there was no stop or any sign of where we were. Everything was covered by a dense fog. The driver opened the door and, without saying anything, got out. The other passengers followed him in complete silence. We stayed there, trapped in our seats, unable to move. We knew that if we got off, something worse would be waiting for us outside. The man next to me was breathing faster now, and I noticed how his hands were tightly gripping the armrests of his seat. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the bus. I realized that we were no longer the only ones who felt that strange restlessness. We were left alone. I continued, feeling my heart racing as I remembered that moment. Sarah kept looking at the door, as if she expected to see someone. But outside, there was only fog and darkness. We couldn't stay there forever, but we couldn't get off either. Something told us that that bus was no longer in the same world where we had started the trip. I noticed that the man next to me was swallowing saliva, clearly disturbed. The atmosphere in our bus had become unbearably dense, and the lights flickered more frequently. I looked forward and saw that several passengers were now murmuring among themselves, restless. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong, and not just in my story. Finally, I made the decision. I told Sarah that we couldn't stay, we had to move on. I grabbed her by the arm and forced her to stand up. We walked slowly towards the door of the bus, but just before we could take the final step towards the exit, we heard that sound again, the footsteps approaching down the hallway. But this time, they were faster, more determined. My words hung in the air, and the bus we were riding on shook violently, almost as if something had hit the outside. All the passengers jumped, and the driver threw a nervous glance at the rearview mirror. The man next to me stared at me, his eyes full of uncertainty. "And what happened?" he asked in a more agitated tone of voice. I took a deep breath and lowered my voice to a whisper. When the footsteps reached us, I paused, looking around the bus where the lights were flickering more and more frequently. I felt like something had reached us, something that didn't belong in this world. Everything went dark. I don't remember how it ended. I only know that when I woke up, I was back on my own. Sarah never came back with me. The bus we were riding on made a loud squeaking noise, almost as if the metal itself was suffering under an invisible pressure. My companion was looking at me now with wide open eyes, his breathing labored. I couldn't tell if it was the story that disturbed him or something else. But then, before I could say one more word, the lights on the bus went out completely. A familiar sound, slow footsteps approaching down the aisle, just like that time. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the air change, as if something was there, waiting for me. "Hey," I whispered, not daring to move. The man didn't answer, but I already knew the answer. Taking a night bus had always had some charm for us, especially when it was a weekend getaway to the beach. Friends, the accumulated tiredness of the week, and the idea of sleeping during the trip until waking up in the coastal paradise sounded like the perfect plan. We weren't a big group, just 5 friends who had decided to take advantage of a holiday to disconnect from everything. We got on the bus at about 11:30 at night. The atmosphere was calm, with just a few passengers scattered around the seats. My friend Daniel always insisted on sitting in the back, saying that it was where one could stretch out better and talk without bothering anyone. As always, we went along with it. First, it was all laughter. Mariana, the most superstitious of the group, said that she didn't like to travel at night. "On the road, there's always something in the darkness that gets on my nerves," she said. We laughed at her fears. But as the bus moved along the route, the darkness outside the windows became denser, and the silence began to envelop us. Little by little, the conversations faded, and eventually, everyone settled into their seats, letting the purr of the engine and the swaying of the bus lull us to sleep. It was then when I first heard the rumor. I was not completely awake, but not completely asleep either. It was one of those moments when the mind is on that fine line between reality and dream. I heard someone mention something about an accident on the same road we were traveling on. I couldn't tell who was saying it or even if it came from a passenger near us, but it made me open my eyes. I looked at my friends, but they all seemed asleep, or at least half asleep. I didn't give it much importance. Who hasn't heard rumors about accidents on roads, especially on long, dark routes like this? Yet, something in the way I heard it made me uneasy. Shortly after, I began to notice something strange. The bus was stopping at regular intervals, as if the driver was forced to brake suddenly for something he couldn't see. The other passengers seemed too absorbed in their own dreams to notice, but I felt it. The light jerks at first became more pronounced. My mind went back to that comment about the accident, but I told myself that they were just superstitions. I was letting myself be influenced by some nonsense that I probably hadn't even really heard, until Mariana woke up suddenly. Mariana sat up in her seat with an expression that I hadn't seen on her before, as if she had just woken up from a nightmare. I looked at her, half smiling, trying to relax the atmosphere. "What's wrong?" I asked in a low voice, trying not to wake the others. She didn't answer me at first. Her eyes were fixed on the front of the bus, as if she expected to see something she didn't want to explain. Finally, after a couple of seconds, she whispered, "I heard something strange in my dreams. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. I don't know. It was a voice. Someone said that this bus had an accident." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know if I should tell her that I had also heard something similar, although in a state of semi-unconsciousness. Perhaps we were influenced by the darkness, the tiredness, and the situation in general. In the end, I just limited myself to giving her a quiet laugh and making a gesture for her to go back to sleep. "Stop thinking about those things. It was surely just a dream. We're fine." Mariana nodded, although she didn't seem convinced. She lay down again, but I could notice that she wasn't going to fall asleep again. At that moment, a small gust of wind went through the bus. Something impossible, since the windows were closed. It was so slight that I doubted if I had really felt it or if it was an imaginary current that my increasingly alert mind had created. The driver kept braking intermittently. He had done it about 5 times already, but the strange thing was not only the braking but the duration of these stops. It was as if he stopped for something invisible on the road and then, after a few seconds, would start moving again without anyone asking questions. I decided to watch it more closely. At the next sudden stop, I didn't have to wait long. After a few minutes, the bus slowed down again and finally stopped. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Only the thick darkness that covered everything like an infinite blanket. The driver was still with his hands firm on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. He wasn't moving. He wasn't making any effort to resume the trip. My friends were still asleep, but deep down, I felt that something was wrong. The silence that surrounded us was so absolute that I couldn't even hear the typical noises of an idling engine. The driver then slowly turned his head to his right, as if he were looking at something or someone that wasn't there. My heart raced and then raced again. At that moment, Mariana leaned towards me again, whispering in a trembling voice, "You heard it, right?" My eyes met hers and I couldn't lie. I nodded slightly, trying to look calm. I didn't want to alarm her, but the situation had already started to feel oppressive. Something didn't fit, and we weren't the only ones who noticed it. The bus kept moving forward, but the atmosphere inside had become denser. It wasn't just Mariana anymore. I was also starting to notice things. Every time the bus stopped, something in the darkness seemed to be closer. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The driver, who at first had seemed like a calm and confident figure, now looked tense, almost nervous, as if he was following a path that he himself feared. Daniel, who used to be the most joking, finally woke up. He rubbed his eyes and looked at us with a half-sleepy smile. "Why do you have those faces? What did I miss?" Before we could answer him, the bus made another sudden stop, but this time it was different. Instead of stopping, it swayed from side to side, as if something huge had passed by at high speed. The impact shook all the passengers, waking them up, and I saw the driver struggling with the steering wheel, his face pale as if he was seeing something terrifying on the road. "What the hell was that?" someone shouted from the seats. The driver didn't answer. He continued to struggle with the steering wheel, his hands white from the pressure. Finally, with a grunt of effort, he managed to straighten the bus. But what happened next was much worse. The interior lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was an electrical problem, but soon I realized that the flickering coincided with something else. Every time the lights went out, I heard soft, barely audible footsteps running down the aisle. But when the lights came back on, there was no one there, just silence. My friends noticed it too. Mariana shrank in her seat, clinging to my arm, while Daniel stared ahead without saying a word. The bus stopped again, this time completely. But we weren't at any stop, not even on a curve in the road. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. The driver turned off the engine, turned his head slowly, and without looking at us, spoke in a dry voice, "Don't keep looking outside." No one moved or said anything. We all understood that something was happening beyond our understanding. I looked out the window despite the warning. At first, I saw nothing, just the reflection of my own face in the glass. But then, something moved in the dim light. It was a tall, thin figure walking slowly towards the bus. His walk was strange, as if he wasn't touching the ground, and his face. I couldn't see well, but it had something twisted unnaturally. My heart was beating so fast, I felt like I might faint. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. Every step of that thing seemed to echo inside my head. "We have to go," someone shouted from the front seats. The driver made no effort to start the bus. Mariana looked at me with wide eyes, and for the first time in the whole trip, I felt truly afraid. Daniel got up from his seat and approached the driver. "What's going on?" he asked, almost demanding an answer. The driver didn't answer. He just muttered something under his breath, too low for us to hear. It was then when Daniel saw it. His face lost all color, backing away as if he had seen a ghost. "He's not human," he shouted. We didn't need an explanation. We all jumped up, trying to get out of our seats. The figure that was approaching was already next to the window, his face pressed against the glass. He had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to absorb all the light. I tried to open the emergency door, but it was stuck. The others were also screaming. Some were praying, others simply paralyzed with terror. The bus started to move again, but this time, not because the driver had turned it on. We felt a tug, as if something was pushing it from the outside. The figure was still there, moving between the windows, watching us. I couldn't understand how it moved so fast, how it was everywhere at once. The driver, now in an almost catatonic state, did nothing. He simply stood there, whispering meaningless words. Finally, when I thought that all was lost, the lights of the bus came back on completely. The figure disappeared, The bus suddenly stopped and stood motionless in the middle of the road. We were all breathing heavily, sweaty, and confused. The driver, with trembling hands, stood up and opened the bus door without saying a word. We got off quickly without looking back. We never talked about what happened that night. None of us took a night bus again. The bus was almost full when we got on. My son, in my arms, was somewhat restless from the excitement of the trip. We were heading to see my parents, a trip we had planned for weeks. Noah, barely 5 years old, couldn't stop looking everywhere, fascinated by the simple fact of being on a bus. I chose a seat towards the back, closer to the window so he could see the landscape, and I sat next to him. At that time of the morning, the sun came through the windows and projected long shadows that moved with the vehicle. As soon as we sat down, I noticed something peculiar. Some people, not all but several, began to observe us. At first, I didn't give it importance. After all, Noah had that energy that attracted glances. It was common for people to look at him and smile. He had a magnetic personality that had always aroused sympathy. However, those glances weren't exactly kind. They weren't the kind that are dedicated to a curious child or a tired parent. The first hour passed without further incident. Noah entertained himself by looking out the window, pointing at trees, cars, and small towns that passed quickly before our eyes. I tried not to pay attention to the passengers, but out of the corner of my eye, I kept noticing the same individuals who had previously looked at us with curiosity. Now they continued doing so, as if they could not take their eyes off us. Their gazes had something somewhat disturbing. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps they were bored, or maybe Noah reminded them of some child they knew. I did not want to be alarmed. I did not want my son to perceive my discomfort. So, I decided to ignore them and concentrated on maintaining a light conversation with him. We talked about how excited we were to see the grandparents and how we were going to spend the weekend exploring the fields where I played as a child. But as the bus moved forward, that feeling of discomfort intensified. The passengers continued to observe us, and it was no longer just with curiosity. It was a kind of cold fascination, as if they were waiting for something. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something in their eyes, a dark shadow that should not be there. I turned around several times to look around, and every time I did, those who were looking at us would quickly look away, as if they didn't want to be discovered. Noah curled up on my lap and began to nod off sleepily, which gave me a little relief. I thought that maybe when he fell asleep, all that discomfort would disappear, as if he was the reason for so much attention. I stroked his hair gently, feeling his breathing become slower and deeper until he finally fell asleep. That gave me time to observe more closely. There was one man in particular, sitting a few rows ahead, who worried me more than the others. He was wearing an old but neat suit, something strange for a bus ride. His hands were clasped in his lap, and his head tilted slightly towards us. Although I tried to hide it, I could feel his eyes on us, watching every movement, especially Noah's. It was then that I noticed a disturbing detail. The man did not blink. He remained in the same position, with that neutral expression and his eyes fixed, without a single movement that denoted fatigue or distraction. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to relax, telling myself that it was all part of my imagination, that I was exaggerating. But it was difficult, very difficult. The looks were still there, constant, like a weight that I could not get rid of. In an attempt to distract myself, I looked out the window and concentrated on the landscape that passed by at full speed. But something inside me did not let me be calm. It was as if a silent warning resonated in my mind, asking me to be alert. I decided to do something to break that tension. I got up carefully without waking Noah and approached the driver. I wanted to ask him how much longer it was until the next stop. Anything that would help me distract myself from the discomfort. As I walked down the aisle, I felt the looks following me, and although I did not turn to look directly, I could feel them burning the back of my neck. The driver answered me reluctantly, as if he were upset by the interruption. There were about 2 more hours left. I turned around to return to my seat, and it was then that I noticed it. The passengers, those who had been watching me, had moved. Now they were closer. It was subtle, just a couple of seats closer to where Noah and I were, but I couldn't help but feel like they had done it on purpose. I sat back down, trying not to show nervousness. Noah was still sleeping, oblivious to what was happening around him. And even though I tried to stay calm, I couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. People shouldn't act like that. Nobody travels on a bus like that. Not without reason, not without motive. Minutes passed, and then I felt a soft touch on my shoulder. I turned my head slowly, and there was the man in the suit, now standing next to me. His dull eyes were fixed on Noah. "Yours?" he asked in a low voice. My heart skipped a beat. The seemingly simple question was charged with a strange energy. There was nothing particularly threatening in the man's tone, but the way his eyes remained fixed on Noah put me on alert. Why would someone ask a question like that? "Yes, he is my son," I answered, trying to stay calm, but I felt my voice tremble a little. The man nodded slowly, without taking his eyes off Noah. Something in his presence made the air in the bus turn heavier, as if an invisible pressure began to press my chest. I tried to think of some excuse to divert the conversation or even end it immediately, but before I could say anything else, he spoke again. "He seems special," he murmured, this time without hiding the strange tone in his voice. I didn't answer. Something inside me told me I shouldn't. Instead, I watched him in silence, waiting for him to leave, to turn around and walk away. But he didn't. He continued standing, leaning slightly over us, with his dead eyes still fixed on my son. I felt the urge to get him out of there, to flee from the bus as soon as possible. But we were in the middle of nowhere, with no other option than to continue the trip. After a few seconds that seemed eternal, the man straightened up and, without further ado, returned to his seat. His walk was slow and precise. My breathing stabilized, but the discomfort did not disappear. In fact, it seemed to have settled deeper in my chest. Noah shifted in my lap, his small, restless body as if he sensed something in his dreams. But he did not wake up. The atmosphere on the bus had changed. Everything seemed colder, darker, as if the sunny day we had enjoyed at the beginning of the trip had been left behind. I looked out the window, hoping to see some sign of an upcoming stop, something that would make me escape from that situation. But all I saw was an endless landscape of countryside, lonely roads, and trees that stretched to the horizon. I decided not to think about the man and his words anymore. I tried to distract myself by looking at my phone, but there was no signal. The empty net bars seemed to mock me. Time passed slowly, and even though I tried to stay calm, I couldn't help but glance sideways at the other passengers. It seemed like they weren't watching me so directly anymore, but there was something in their expressions that was still disturbing. Their glances were brief, furtive, but full of a silent expectation that I couldn't understand. A slight moan came out of Noah's lips, and I looked at him immediately. He stirred in his sleep, as if something disturbed him. He was soaked in sweat, which surprised me since the bus felt colder than before. His face contracted, and suddenly he began to murmur words that I didn't understand. It wasn't the first time he had spoken in his dreams, but this time, there was something different. His voice was barely a whisper, and although I tried to listen, I couldn't catch any words clearly. I carefully settled him better in my lap, hoping that he would calm down. But his murmur continued, almost as if he were repeating something over and over again. My skin crawled. I felt like we were being watched, that something on that bus wasn't right. Just when I was thinking about waking him up, Noah opened his eyes. But what I saw in his gaze was not the usual brightness of my son. His eyes were out of focus, as if he were still trapped in some kind of dream. He looked at me but didn't seem to recognize me immediately. I called him by his name in a low voice, caressing his face, trying to get him to come back to, "Yes, Noah. Son, are you okay?" I asked, trying to hide the worry in my voice. He blinked slowly, and his expression returned to its usual one. But there was something in his eyes that wouldn't completely disappear. Something that put me on alert, although I couldn't define exactly what it was. "Dad," he finally said in an almost inaudible whisper. I don't want him to look at me. I froze. I felt a lump in my throat. I swallowed, trying to keep calm, although a part of me was beginning to panic. Who, Noah? Are you talking about? I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. He simply shook his head, snuggling further into my lap with his face hidden against my chest. I didn't insist. I didn't want to scare him more than he already seemed to be, but my mind kept going round and round. What did he mean? Had he seen something in his dreams? Or perhaps he was referring to the man who had approached us before. Could he have sensed him somehow, even in his sleep? The feeling that something was wrong kept growing inside me. I wanted to ask the driver to drop us off at the next stop, no matter where it was. I preferred to wait at any station than to continue on that bus. But before I could decide, I felt the vehicle beginning to slow down. I looked out the window and saw that we were arriving at a small stop in the middle of nowhere. A dilapidated building that had once been a bus station, with a couple of abandoned cars nearby. The driver announced that we would make a brief stop so that the passengers could stretch their legs. I stood up with Noah in my arms, ready to get off, even if it was just to get some fresh air and get him out of that environment. However, just when we were about to get off, I felt someone touch my arm again. This time it was stronger, with a firmness that made me stop immediately. It was the man in the suit. "You must not get off," he said, his voice deeper and loaded with an intention that froze my blood. My instinct was to back away. I felt his cold and firm hand on my arm, and a shiver ran through me from head to toe. I looked at Noah, who was still curled up against my chest, his breathing calm. A small part of me considered ignoring the man and getting off anyway. However, something in his tone, in the firmness of his warning, stopped me. "You must not get off," he repeated, and this time, I saw something in his eyes. It was not the same man who had looked at us before with that strange fascination. He seemed more human, as if, for the first time in the whole trip, he was truly present. There was an urgency in his gaze, something I could not ignore. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man let go but kept staring at me. "It is not safe here for him," he said, pointing with his head towards Noah. "They know it. They know who he is. They've been waiting for him." My heart pounded. I didn't understand what he meant, but his words filled me with an irrational terror. Everything in me screamed at me to run, to get off that bus. But at the same time, there was something in what he said that echoed my deepest fears. I looked at the other passengers. That group that had been watching us was now standing, slowly moving towards the exit of the bus. But their movements were strange, almost choreographed, as if they were acting in perfect synchrony. None of them were looking at me, but I felt like they were completely aware of us. The man in the suit took a step towards me. "Listen, I know you don't understand, but you have to trust me. Don't let him get out. If you do, there will be no turning back." Noah muttered something in his sleep, and my skin prickled. Everything in me wanted to protect him, even though I didn't know from what or why. My legs were shaking. I was caught between the urge to run away and the warning of that stranger. I finally made up my mind. I sank back into the seat, hugging Noah tightly against my chest, trying to offer him the shield of my arms while I looked out the window. The other passengers got off one by one, but none of them turned their heads back. Not even once. The man in the suit, who had remained standing next to us, seemed to relax slightly. He looked at me with an expression that I didn't know how to interpret. It was a gesture of relief, but also of resignation. "You have been saved from something you shouldn't know," he said in a low voice. Then, without another word, he walked to the front of the bus and disappeared between the seats. I remained there, hugging Noah while the bus started moving again. My breathing was still fast, but little by little, I felt the weight of fear disappear. Noah, still asleep, moved slightly but didn't wake up. The bus continued on its way along the empty road, leaving behind that small and lonely stop. I felt that something deep, something terrible, had been left behind too. I didn't know if the man in the suit would reappear or what had really happened, but I knew that, for some reason, my son and I had escaped from something that had been waiting for us. The rest of the trip passed in silence, but the disturbing glances of the passengers did not return. And when we finally reached our destination, I made sure to look back, determined to forget what had happened. Although I knew I could never do so completely, I didn't know what awaited us at that stop, and I never asked. Maybe it was for the best this way. It was not the first time I sat in the seat reserved for the bus staff, but that morning, something was different. I got on Unit 17 as usual, greeted the driver, and settled into my usual seat. The morning shift had always been quiet, with the same passengers who took the daily route to work. But that day, when I sat down, I noticed something that shouldn't be there. A simple white envelope without any special markings on the seat. I took it cautiously, wondering if some passenger had accidentally left it. I opened it as the bus began to move. It did not contain money nor a note of thanks for some service, as I had initially thought. What I found was a piece of paper folded carefully, with a single phrase written in cursive letters. "I know where you live." I laughed nervously. I thought it would be a joke in bad taste or some passenger trying to annoy me. I didn't think about it anymore. I folded the paper and put it in my bag, trying to concentrate on my work. But as the hours passed, I couldn't help but look from time to time towards the seat where I had found the letter. The bus advanced along its usual route without incident. The same faces, the same stops, and yet, something in me couldn't get that phrase out of my head. That afternoon, after my shift, I walked towards my apartment, feeling strangely watched. The streets were silent as usual, but something had changed in the air. I looked back, checking that no one was following me. My rational mind told me it was nothing, that I was just exaggerating, but a small tickle on the back of my neck made me quicken my pace. When I got home, I made myself a cup of tea and forced myself to forget the letter. I had to rest, and there was no reason to keep thinking about something so absurd. However, the next day, history repeated itself. This time, the letter was not on the seat, but in the compartment where I kept my jacket. It was another equally immaculate white envelope, and when I opened it, I felt a chill run through me. "How did you sleep last night?" I lay still, looking at the letters, trying to remember if I had told anyone about my insomnia the night before. I didn't remember having done so. My mind began to work on 1,000 theories. Someone was spying on me. Some passenger had become obsessed with me. But I couldn't remember anyone who had paid special attention to me in the last few days. As always, I was the shadow behind the driver, the silent employee who did her shift without anyone paying too much attention to her. The day continued with its routine, but that little letter changed my perception of everything. I felt every look like a scrutiny. Who was watching me? Who knew those details of my personal life? When my shift ended, I decided to stay a little longer at the bus station, watching the passengers getting off the vehicle. None of them seemed particularly suspicious, but there was something in the air, something I couldn't identify, that made me feel like I was in danger. The following days became a disturbing routine. Every morning when I got on the bus, I found a new letter, each one more personal, more detailed than the last. "Your cat won't stop meowing at night. That blue dress looks good on you. You should wear it more often. Don't walk alone through the park so late." I hadn't mentioned to anyone the fact that I had adopted a cat just 2 weeks ago. I also didn't usually share my walking habits with strangers, and definitely no one had commented on my blue dress. All this disturbed me deeply. The letters were not only an invasion of my privacy, they were harassment that I didn't understand. And the worst thing was that I didn't know where the passengers who got on every day came from. They were still the same. No one acted strange or showed any particular interest in me, but I felt that someone among them knew too much. I began to observe them more closely, looking for some clue, some gesture that would tell me who was the author of the letters. However, no one stood out, and that lack of suspects only increased my anxiety. One afternoon, I decided to talk to the driver, Raul, a man who had been working on the same route for years. We had a cordial relationship, although not very close, and I thought that maybe he might have noticed something strange. "Raul, has anything strange ever happened to you on this route?" I asked him as the last passengers of the day got off the bus. He looked at me in the rearview mirror, frowning. "What do you mean?" I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I forced myself to continue. I've been finding letters, anonymous letters, that talk about my personal life. They're starting to worry me. Raoul was silent for a moment, as if he didn't know how to respond. Finally, he sighed and turned slightly in his seat. Look, this job puts you in contact with a lot of strange people. You shouldn't take these things so seriously. It's probably some joker who's been watching you. Ignore him, and soon they'll get tired of you. But I didn't insist. Raoul had always been a practical person, and if he didn't see a direct threat, he wasn't going to give it too much importance. But for me, the situation was getting worse. That night, when I got home, I found a new letter under the door of my apartment. It wasn't on the bus this time. That meant that whoever was stalking me knew where I lived. I opened it with trembling hands, and the message was clearer than ever. I see you tomorrow. I didn't sleep that night. The next day on the bus was torture. Every time a passenger got on, I looked at them carefully, trying to catch some sign, some suspicious movement. But no one paid me more attention than necessary. My hands sweated every time someone passed by me, and the sound of the doors opening and closing made me jump in my seat. When I found the next letter, I refused to read it immediately. I was too scared. I put it in my bag and promised myself that I would read it at home calmly. However, the day progressed slowly, and when the afternoon shift came, the tension was unbearable. During my break, I finally took out the letter. It was the shortest one so far, but its message was clear. Today, a shiver ran down my spine. What was going to happen today? I looked around the empty bus. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I felt an invisible pressure around me, as if something terrible was about to happen. I decided not to go home alone that night. I called a friend, Sarah, and asked her to come pick me up in her car at the end of my shift. I didn't explain everything. I just told her that I didn't feel safe. She accepted immediately, and that small gesture calmed me down a little. The bus made its last stop, and all the passengers got off. Silence filled the vehicle, and I felt momentarily relieved. However, when I went to pick up my things, I found something that made my blood run cold. On my seat, there was a new letter, but this time I wasn't alone. On top of the letter, a small Polaroid photo showed the image of my building in the background. In the darkness, a silhouette could be distinguished, and there, in capital letters, was the last message. I'm here. I felt my legs weaken. How had this person come so far? My heart was beating wildly, and the feeling of being watched was suffocating me. When I got off the bus, I saw Sarah waiting in her car. I ran towards her without looking back. I quickly entered Sarah's car without giving her any immediate explanations. I just asked her to start. My hands were shaking as I tried to explain to her what had been happening, but the words got tangled in my throat. Finally, when I managed to speak, I told her everything about the letters, the photos, and how somehow that person knew everything about me. Have you called the police? She asked me with palpable concern in her voice. I shook my head. Something in me doubted that the authorities could do something. Everything had been too subtle, too calculated. There was no tangible evidence, only anonymous letters that could be considered a joke in bad taste. However, I knew it was not a simple joke. I felt it in my bones. Tomorrow, you are going to stay with me, Sarah told me without giving me the chance to argue. I nodded, grateful not to have to spend the night alone. That night in her house was calm. I tried to stay calm, although my thoughts kept returning to the image of the Polaroid and the silhouette in the photo. I did not know who was doing this or why. I wondered if there was something in my life, some detail that I had overlooked, that had triggered all this. But there were no clear answers, only a constant anguish that did not leave me alone. The next morning, I woke up with a new determination. I was not going to allow this stalker, whoever it was, to take control of my life. Sarah encouraged me to take more serious measures, but I still didn't know exactly what to do. I returned to the bus for my shift, hoping that that feeling of fear and oppression would have diminished with the daylight. However, when I got on the bus that morning, something changed. Everything seemed darker, colder. The vehicle that had always been my routine workspace now seemed hostile, as if the seats and aisles themselves were stalking me. The letters were no longer the only thing that worried me. It was the environment itself. When I got to my seat, the air felt thick, almost unbreathable. There was another letter, of course. This time, I opened it with trembling hands, and the message was simple but heartbreaking. See you soon. I knew something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. During the entire shift, I felt trapped in a kind of suffocating paranoia. No passenger seemed out of the ordinary, but every time someone got on, I wondered if it would be the person behind the letters. I looked everywhere, hoping to see a sign, but there was nothing tangible. Just that feeling that something was very, very wrong. The bus continued its route, and finally, the last stop arrived. There were no more passengers, and the driver, Raoul, was gathering his things. I approached him, trying to act normal, although I knew my face reflected the tension I felt. "Raoul, can you wait for me?" I asked him. He looked at me curiously but nodded. I got off the bus and walked to the station. My plan was to take a taxi, go straight to Sarah's house, and forget about all this for a while. But just when I was about to leave the station, I felt someone watching me. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing a few meters away, right in the shadow of one of the light posts. It was a tall, thin silhouette with a dark coat covering his face. For a second, my whole body paralyzed. I knew that person had been following me, that he had been after the letters all this time. My breathing accelerated, and fear invaded me like a wave. "Raoul!" I screamed, but when I turned to look for the driver, he was no longer there. The bus was gone. When I looked back to where the figure was, there was no one anymore. The street was deserted, silent. I felt an icy cold running down my back. I ran. I didn't look back. I arrived home from work panting, with my heart in my throat. I locked all the doors, checked every window, every corner. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I decided not to go to work. I called in sick and said I would need a couple of days off. Sarah was at work, so I stayed home alone trying to find some solution, something that would give me control over the situation. In the afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number. "Did you like my gift? I'll always be close." My whole body shook. This wasn't just a card game anymore. It was a real threat. I felt like the world was closing in around me, that there was no safe place. That night, I decided to go to the police. But when I explained what was going on, they seemed unimpressed. They said that without clear evidence, they couldn't do much. The officer who attended to me suggested I change jobs, as if that would solve the problem. I came home defeated. I knew I wasn't going to be able to escape that easily. And then I understood. This stalker wouldn't stop. He wouldn't get tired. I was trapped in his game and I had no way out. I haven't taken that bus again. Quit my job. I moved out of town, and Sarah has been helping me stay away from anything that reminds me of those days. It was a long trip, longer than I had imagined. I got on the intercity bus at the central terminal, looking to simply escape the chaos of the city for a few hours. I settled into a seat by the window, thinking the trip would be quiet, lonely, as it had always been on my previous trips. The bus was almost empty, just a few people, each with a lost look, absorbed in their own worlds. On those types of trips, rarely does anything out of the ordinary happen. The desert landscape slowly passed before my eyes, blurring as the miles piled up. But that afternoon, something was different. A few minutes after the bus started, an older man sat next to me. His walk was slow, shuffling his feet with heavy breathing. His appearance was common, maybe too common. Gray hair, somewhat worn but clean clothes, and wrinkled skin that denoted decades of life. He greeted me with a nod, and I, as polite as I was, answered with a nod as well. I didn't think much about him at first. The old man didn't say anything. He stayed silent while the bus moved forward, looking straight ahead, as if he didn't want to disturb the peace of the trip. But after a few minutes, he broke the silence. "It's been years since I took one of these buses," he said with a hoarse voice, looking towards the empty corridor. "I've always preferred the train, but sometimes one is forced to change their habits. Isn't that true?" I nodded without much intention of maintaining a conversation. There was something in his tone that didn't bother me at all, but didn't leave me completely calm either. Maybe it was just my age, I told myself, or the fact that he seemed to have so many stories stored behind those tired eyes. He continued talking slowly, as if he didn't care if I listened to him or not. I lived almost all my life in a small town a few kilometers from here, he continued. A quiet place, too quiet sometimes, until it stopped being so. I frowned, curious about his sudden shift in tone. There was something in his way of telling things that kept my attention, even though I didn't want to admit it. I couldn't help but ask, why did it stop being calm? The old man took a second before answering, as if he was evaluating how much he should say. Disappearances, he muttered, looking towards the bus window. They started a few years ago. People would simply disappear. One day they were there and the next they were gone. As if the earth had swallowed them. I couldn't help but feel a slight shiver running down my spine. There was something in the way he said it, so casual, as simple as if he were talking about the weather or an unimportant anecdote. But the subject was not something that could be taken lightly. And what happened? I asked, a little more interested than I would have liked. The man shrugged, as if he didn't have all the answers. The police investigated, of course. They sent the best officers. There was talk that maybe it was some kind of criminal network or someone with bad intentions. But they never found anything. People simply disappeared, without clues, without traces. It was as if they vanished. He paused, and I could notice a strange shine in his eyes. A mix of sadness and something else. Something that I couldn't identify in that moment. I wanted to think that it was just an old man telling an exaggerated story to kill time. But something inside me told me there was more than he was letting on. The minutes passed in silence as the bus kept moving forward. I tried to concentrate again on the landscape, but the old man's words echoed in my mind. Without realizing it, I was forced to ask him more. And did you know any of those people? I asked, knowing that I probably wouldn't like the answer. The old man nodded slowly. Many were neighbors, friends, people from the town. Some were young, others not so much, but they all disappeared in the same way. One night they were home. The next day, they were never seen again. The air inside the bus seemed to have become thicker. I looked at him out of the corner of my eye, and for a moment, I regretted having started that conversation. But it was too late. Some say that the town was cursed, he continued. Others believe that there was someone, a man or a creature, that lurked in the shadows, taking whoever crossed his path. But who knows? He smiled, but it was a bitter smile, joyless. The truth is that no one ever knew what really happened. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to keep my composure. Maybe he was just an old man with a made-up story, looking for someone to share it with. However, something in his tone and his gaze told me that there was a darker truth buried in his words. And for some reason, I had been the unlucky one to hear it. And when did it stop happening? I asked, trying to sound casual, although I felt a growing discomfort in my chest. The old man stared at me for a moment before answering. I felt as if he was evaluating each one of my gestures, each one of my movements. Finally, he looked away, directing his gaze back to the front of the bus. People began to leave, he answered, his voice low and steady. Little by little, almost without making noise. They left their homes, their jobs, everything they knew. Some said they were leaving because they were afraid. Others because they could no longer bear the sadness that the disappearances brought. I was one of the last to leave. The bus continued its slow advance, and for a moment, I felt the need to change seats, to get away from that man and his words that seemed to be enveloping me in some kind of mental fog. But I stood still, almost hypnotized by what I was hearing. And you weren't afraid? My voice came out weaker than I had expected. The old man let out a low, hoarse laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh someone uses to mask something else, something much darker. At first, yes, he said after a long sigh, but over time, fear becomes a companion, like an old friend that one learns to accept. You know it's there, but it no longer affects you as at first. His words were disturbing, but there was something in his way of speaking that made me feel like he wasn't telling me the whole story. I didn't want to ask more, but the questions kept piling up in my mind. Maybe out of curiosity, Or maybe because a part of me knew there was something important that he hadn't revealed yet. Then I began, carefully choosing my words. If the police didn't find anything, and the people just disappeared, how come you left without problems? The old man slowly turned towards me, and for the first time, I noticed the depth in his eyes. It was as if, behind that tired look, there was an abyss of secrets that he didn't want or couldn't share. Not all of us were so lucky, he replied, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. Some, they let us go, but not before having seen something they shouldn't have seen. The atmosphere inside the bus had become oppressive. The slight sound of the engine seemed distant, almost like a distant echo, while the world around me blurred. My heart began to beat faster, and the air felt thick, loaded with a tension that I couldn't explain. Without realizing it, my hands gripped the edge of my seat. What did they see? I asked, although I knew that maybe I didn't want to hear the answer. The old man stared at me, and his expression changed. Now, there was something else in his face, something that made my hair stand on end. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something much deeper, as if he carried a burden too heavy for too long. I saw the reason why they took them, he murmured. I saw what was happening when someone disappeared. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue, but he seemed to have lost himself in his own thoughts. The bus moved on, but I could no longer concentrate on anything else but the old man's words and the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. And what happened to them? I insisted, feeling a growing urgency. The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, as if searching for something in the desert landscape that stretched beyond the glass. He finally turned to me, his face pale under the dim light of the bus. They didn't go anywhere, he said with a chilling calm. They're still here. They've always been here. A deathly silence fell between us. My mind tried to process what he had just said, but it couldn't make sense of his words. Before I could ask anything else, the bus made a slight turn, and something caught my attention in the reflection of the window. The seat behind us, that until then had been empty, now seemed occupied. I hadn't heard anyone get on or move, but clearly, someone was sitting there. My breathing quickened, and I slowly turned my head to look directly, but there was no one. The seat was empty. My heart began to pound, beating hard. I looked back at the reflection in the window, hoping to have mistaken myself, but I saw it again. A blurry figure sitting right behind us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and a primitive instinct told me that I should get off the bus at the next stop, that something was terribly wrong. But I didn't move. The old man didn't say anything. His gaze remained fixed on the window, as if he could also see what I saw, although he didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, he seemed to be waiting for it. You see, he asked in a whisper, without taking his eyes off the reflection. I swallowed, unable to answer. Something in his tone made me feel as if this whole conversation had been a trap, as if he had brought me to this point just for me to see what he already knew was there. The figure behind us didn't move, but its presence was palpable. My hands were shaking, and the air seemed to become thicker, difficult to breathe. I tried to get up, but my legs didn't respond. I was paralyzed. No matter how much you try to escape, continued the old man with a terrifying calm, they always find you, just like they found the others. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. Something was oppressing my chest, as if an invisible force was preventing me from moving or screaming. The figure in the reflection began to move slowly, getting closer to us, although when I looked directly at the seat, there was nothing. Only in the reflection. The old man finally turned to me, and his face had changed. He was no longer the tired man who had started to tell me his stories. Now his gaze was cold, empty, and a slight smile formed on his lips. "You'll be next," he said, as the bus plunged into the darkness of the road. With no more passengers, no more witnesses, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. They had already found me. The bus continued on its way, but for me, the trip was over.